There's this misconception that flow means a state in which you relax. What you just described is quite the contrary to that. It's in a very, very exerting situation or environment. And when you can relax within that, that's when you're truly in the flow state.
The biggest creativity myth is that creativity is about having an idea or a flash of insight. And then once you have the idea, all you have to do is execute. That view of creativity is false. Scientifically, empirically, we know it's false.
And the current standard definition says that there has to be novelty and usefulness for something to be declared creative.
You can make any idea good if you go through this process. It's not about the idea.
Somehow in society, there's this idea that if you can paint or sing or act or dance, automatically makes you creative.
And mastering your craft, I don't think anyone can demonstrate a high level of creativity without investing that effort.
We don't need the help of the conscious mind to even recognize what the unconscious is throwing, perhaps. My guest today occupies a rare and fascinating position in the world of creativity research. He is simultaneously a scientist, a practitioner, and a storyteller of human innovation. Dr. Keith Sawyer is the Morgan Distinguished Professor in Educational Innovations at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and one of the world's most widely cited experts on creativity, collaboration, and learning. As someone deeply invested in understanding creativity from the inside out, I'm particularly delighted to welcome an academic researcher of his stature to the show. His research challenges the myth of the solitary genius, arguing instead that creativity is social, relational, and emergent. It lives in the space between people as much as within them. After earning his degree in computer science from MIT, Keith designed video games for Atari, worked as a management consultant advising Fortune 500 companies, and spent years as a jazz pianist playing with the Chicago Improv theater groups. He then went on to earn his Ph.D. in psychology under none other than Csikszentmihalyi, the father of flow, at the University of Chicago. That journey from code to jazz to cognitive science is in itself a lived argument for the interdisciplinary nature of creative thinking. He has published 20 books, including Explaining Creativity, Group Genius, Zigzag, and his most recent, Learning to See, published by MIT Press in 2025, in which he interviewed over 100 artists and designers across 50 institutions to understand how the highest level of visual creativity are taught and transmitted. His work has been featured everywhere, from the New York Times to NPR, and his publications have been cited over 30,000 times, placing him in the top 1% of psychologists worldwide. Welcome to the Creativity Dialogues. Enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Creativity Dialogues, Dr. Keith. It's such a pleasure and honor to have you here today.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
I think the really curious thing for me was that how did you go from designing video games to becoming one of the world's leading creativity scientists?
Yes, it was a journey where my first job after college, I had a computer science degree. And at that time in the 1980s, people who designed video games really had to do a lot of coding. I mean, hardcore coding, where you were inside the innards of the computer. And it really was a lot of fun programming for Atari video games. But I had an artificial intelligence background. So I went from there to doing artificial intelligence custom software development. That was my second job. And I became interested in cognitive psychology, what goes on in the mind when people are thinking and when people are learning, and specifically musical cognition, and decided I wanted to go to graduate school and study cognition and creativity. So that was my journey through artificial intelligence and creativity and cognition.
You studied creativity with the man who gave us flow, Csikszentmihalyi. How was that experience? What did you learn from him? Was there something that translated into your work?
Yes, absolutely. So that was Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and that is a Hungarian name. So he was from Hungary and immigrated to the United States as a young child and had his own degree from the University of Chicago, and then became a professor at the University of Chicago, where I got my PhD as well. So he was in the psychology department. That's where I went with my interest in cognitive science and cognitive psychology. So it was a blend for me of that cognitive science. And in his case, I would say a humanistic psychology, or what became known in the 1990s as positive psychology. So in his research of flow, of the most positive or optimal experience, in his question, what is the peak experience for a human being? What is happiness? He felt that it wasn't just relaxing, it wasn't sitting on a couch and watching television, that he started doing research, a very solid empirical scientific research, and found the peak human experience, you actually are intensely exerting yourself. You're facing a serious challenge. You have stretched your skills to their maximum. And this is what he called optimal experience. So that's what a lot of people don't understand about flow, is that it actually is very intense experience. And in his writings, he says sometimes it's not even pleasurable when you're going through it. But after the fact, and you look back and you realize that was an optimal experience for you, one of your peak experiences. But when you're in it, you might not be thinking this is a peak experience. But as he was doing this research and interviewing and observing people having these experiences, he discovered that this is often when people have their most creative insights. This is when the most exceptional creativity happens, when people are in these optimal experience states. So that is how he got interested in creativity, was the very close relationships between flow and creativity. So when I was in graduate school, that's how I encountered him. Was I took one of his classes called The Psychology of Creativity, and he was publishing research in the psychology of creativity in addition to his flow research. And that's how I ended up doing my master's thesis with him after my first 2 years there. And then I got to know him very well, and he became my doctoral thesis advisor as well.
Wow, that was such a privilege. And thank you so much for clarifying the meaning of flow as well as we went along, because there's this misconception that flow means a state in which you relax or things just seem to happen. And, what you just described is quite the contrary to that. It's in a very, very exerting kind of situation or environment. And when you can relax within that, that's when you're truly in the flow state. It's not just when you're casually relaxing or in leisure that you arrive at the flow.
In my own podcast, I have a episode on flow where that's my emphasis as well. Some people think that it's a meditative state where you have your
Mm,
eyes
mm,
closed and you're just dreaming almost at one with the universe. And no, that's not how it happens. It's this very intense state of facing a serious and intense challenge, and using all of your skills and abilities he referred to it as the flow challenge, which is the match or the balance between skills and challenges. Exactly. And so that's when you're at your peak, and that's when you're most likely to generate your maximum creativity.
mm. Right. How would you define creativity?
Oh, it's so difficult. And I sometimes I hate answering the question. I even have a Substack post where I think the title is the more I know about creativity, the less I'm sure what it is, because there's so many different researchers and all of them study. It's like the elephant, where it depends on whether you're feeling the toe of the elephant or the trunk of the elephant. Um, for me, I would say creativity is a process of a certain type of process where, as you're engaging in this type of process, a human practice, a way of being in the world, where mindsets, where at the end of the process, certain objects or artifacts emerge. And sometimes they are things we might recognize as creative, sometimes they're not. So then I have to explain what the process is. So for me, that's what I do is I study the process, the creative process, which I think of as fundamentally improvisational. And so this is the creativity myth that it comes from an idea. The biggest creativity myth is that creativity is about having an idea or a flash of insight. And then once you have the idea, once you have the flash of insight, then all you have to do is execute on the insight. You have the idea, you build it, you make it. And then once you're done, you have the artifact and you say, here it is, I made it. So that view of creativity is false. Scientifically, empirically, we know it's false. Theoretically, it's false. It's not about the idea, it's about the process. And what I mean by that is you start engaging in the process without knowing what you're doing, without knowing what's going to happen at the end. And
Yes.
creativity emerges while you're engaged in the process. It
Yes.
emerges along the way. And it's not one thing that emerges. So it's not as if you're working for 3, 4, or 5 days, and at the fifth day, okay, now I know what it is, and now I've had the idea, and then it's gonna be linear from there. That's not the way it works either. What happens is every day you have a small idea, and then you have a small idea the next day, and then each one builds on the previous one, so there's an iterative aspect to the process, so that's why I said it's improvisational, and the path varies, changes direction. So that's why I said it's a practice. It's a set of mindsets. It's improvisational. So so when people ask me to define creativity, it's hard. And I have to give this long,
Yes.
complicated answer.
Actually, thank you for this because my PhD research is on the definition of creativity. And the current standard definition says that there has to be novelty and usefulness for something to be declared creative. And I so agree with you that it's that in between gap from novelty to usefulness that's being completely overlooked. You call it process. I call it agency or personal agency. Since it's not stated, it really leaves, there's a lot of injustice, I believe, in the definition itself, an epistemical injustice, because without having agency or process, as you call it, nothing, just an idea can never reach usefulness. And that's what Steve Jobs said, that he said, what, there's nothing, special about ideas. Everyone gets them. But he says, then why don't 99% of people manifest those ideas? It's because the process, the agency, that's just so hard that most people give up or don't even begin. So thank you so much for clarifying that. I really appreciate that.
Steve Jobs has the famous quotation exactly. So I'm not the first person to say that the creativity being an idea is the mythical view. And when I've interviewed artists and designers for my most recent book, over 100 artists and designers, and yes, over and over again, the people I talk to, professional artists and designers, this is what they tell me about their own professional practice. And they'll say things like, uh, you can make any idea good if you go through this process. It's not about the idea.
Perfect. Why do you think that creativity is such a contested field? With different domains having contrasting views and opinions on it.
You mean as in the
In
elephant
the
or
definite,
different views?
yes, yeah, the very elephant in the room, which is why do they have contrasting ideas? The education field has a different thing. The social sciences have different opinions. I was just wondering that why do you think that there isn't a universally accepted foundational base for creativity?
Oh, I see. Yes, I don't think we're disagreeing with each other though, if you look across the entire field of creativity research. So we don't have clashing definitions. So I don't think or there are factions, right? Where uh,
Hmm.
one faction says it's this and another faction says it's that, except maybe to some extent, and this happens in a lot of scientific fields, where there might be one group who says, my view is more important than your view. So I should get more of the research dollars from the granting agency because my view is more valuable. But it doesn't mean that your view is false. It just
Mm,
means that my view has more importance. So, but I think that's true about particle physics. Some
yeah,
say atoms are more important than molecules. But no, I don't. I don't sense there's disagreement. Maybe, say, in my case, I tend to focus on group dynamics because my own research, I've studied jazz ensembles and improvisational theater groups. And I'm a jazz pianist. So going back to how I got interested in creativity research is that I'm a jazz pianist. And I specifically am interested in the dynamics of me playing with other musicians in an ensemble. Playing by myself is a totally different experience. So I
right.
became interested as a researcher in the interactional dynamics among members of an ensemble, and that's what I've spent my career studying. So I think researchers should spend more time studying group dynamics, and most creativity
Yes.
researchers tend to study the individual.
Hmm.
So I think that's a worthwhile line of research, and there should be psychologists who study the individual. But I wish there were more researchers studying a group.
Yeah.
But I don't disagree with the individual psychologist either.
Hmm. Hmm. Actually, one of the reasons for asking these idea of conflicting views is that there seems to be this idea that creativity is just automatically associated with the arts. And this is something that I've always wondered about because I've had friends who come to me and they would say things like, I don't have a single creative bone in my body. And I ask them, what do you mean when you say that? So they're like, oh, we don't sing or paint like you. And I found that there is somehow in society, there's this idea that if you can paint or sing or act or dance, that just automatically makes you creative. And living an artist's life throughout my life, I've discovered I know so many artists who I wouldn't call creative at all. And then I found people from different fields being incredibly creative. So, why do you think this idea persists that if you're an artist, you're just automatically creative?
Oh, I have an interesting story to tell you. So I teach, of course, as a professor, and I teach an undergraduate course called The Psychology of Creativity. And I could teach this as a ordinary psychology class where I give lectures and have them read scientific research. And I do have them do some of that, but I assign them three, I call them studio projects. So one of them, I have them design a typeface, and I borrowed a typeface design project from a typeface design professor in a design school who is a professional typeface designer. And I structure the typeface design project in such a way that it's very similar to a typeface design project that would be used in a typeface design class. And when I talk to my friends who are not creatives and they're not typeface designers, they'll say things like to me like, "How could you have your psychology students? How could you ask them to design a typeface? That's horrible. They don't know anything about designing they don't know anything about typefaces. I would hate an assignment like that. But every one of the students designs a great typeface because I structure the assignment in such a way that there are parameters that guide them through a process, iterative, just like we've been discussing, in such a way, if you go through the process, then you will generate something good. And that's one of the messages I want them to get from taking the class, that it really is about the process. You don't have to be a typeface designer. And like you were saying, you don't have to be creative. You just have to learn the process. And in the same class, okay, so this is the second part of this story. I have them all create a music soundtrack using DJ production software. And they don't have to be musicians. Most of them are not musicians. And they use fairly easy to use music production software where they sample and loop from a popular song and then they mix together. It sounds like incredibly impossible for someone who's not a musician. Same thing. My wife said, "How could you ask your students to do this? I would fail miserably." I've had some of my colleagues here. I would never be able to do this. But every one of the students makes something that sounds beautiful. And again, the message is when you follow the process, and I have to guide them through the process because they don't know the process yet. So I give them a carefully designed set of parameters where they are guided through the process. But now they've gone through my class, they've had two experiences where they're guided through the process. And they've had that experience that's so much more powerful than reading my book about here's the process. So they do read my book about the process, but now they have the experience of the process. And now you don't have to be creative. You just have to learn the process.
Yeah, no, thank you for reiterating the importance of the process so distinctly, and you articulated it so well, because I've always wondered that when I think about Melrode's 4P process, which is one of the most widely used, which talks of person, process, product, and press, I wondered in the definition why only the person was there, and then you had the product and the press, but somehow in the definition, the process just got wiped out. It just never shows up. So thank you for really bringing up that without a creator, we don't really have creativity. So only novelty and usefulness are not as satisfactory criteria. I would like to come now to your musician side, which you've been sort of bringing up, but I'd like to understand that better. That how do you hold being a scientist as well as an artist? Most people struggle with that. How have you had both of these seemingly contradictory paths? How do you hold both?
I think it's been complementary. And I think when I read biographies of people who are much more exceptionally creative than I am, you find that a lot of scientists also have a artistic side,
Mhm.
maybe because you can turn the switch off of the scientific part and then use a different aspect of your brain, or in some cases, uh, something maybe more physical or more bodily. So typically with music, so in my case, I'm a pianist. So there's very much a bodily aspect to playing a musical instrument. It's not just something you do with your head. Uh, you're very much using your body to play piano. I mean, it's like imagine woodworking or gardening. I mean, that's how much you're using your hands when you play piano. You think it's Mozart, it's Beethoven, it's all, abstract and theoretical, but no, you're using your fingers and your arms. So it really is a big switch from, thinking about social theory and, a psychological methodology. So I like that idea of that moment, I suppose, of turning off that side of your mind. And also, it's because of when you're absorbed in the moment, playing music really does take everything.
Mm.
It really is split second to split second. You can't stop in the middle and think about something you left out in your methodological analysis, for
Yeah.
10 seconds and then go back to playing the song. It just doesn't work. So the fact that it fully absorbs your mind, it really does force you to turn off that aspect. So yeah, I think I don't know if I'd say they work together so much as that they're complementary.
Yes. Very well described. What are the five characteristics that distinguish jazz improvisation from compositional creativity?
Oh, is that a test from something I wrote?
I, maybe not.
Let's see, maybe there were six and something I wrote in four and some. Um, so yes, so I've written quite a bit about the difference between improvisational creativity and compositional creativity. So you think about composers who are putting something down on a page and then it's fixed and static, and it could be there for 100 years. And then improvisational creativity, it is not written down on the page. So it's evanescent, it's ephemeral, it doesn't exist except in someone's mind. So when I refer to improvisational creativity, I refer to performance, something that is in the moment. And compositional creativity, something that you could take as much time as you want. So you could do a draft uh, if you're the composer. You could do a draft, and if you don't like the first draft, you could do the second draft, and you could keep revising and doing drafts as many times as you like. And then at some point, you can say, now it's done. And that's your creative process. And then there's a product at the end. In improvisation, the process is the product. So that's sort of like my motto, I suppose, or my
Mhm.
tagline, that the process is the product in
Mm.
improvisation. So you're not improvising with the intention of generating a product that will then live on to be something independent of the performance. The process or the performance is its own goal, its own intention. Uh, Nowadays we have modern recording technology. There's some fancy microphones, and that you're recording a live album that your manager is planning to sell. But for most of human history, that was not the case. You were doing a performance, and no one would ever hear it again. So yes, the process is the product. So I've only given you one of the five
That's totally
differences.
fine. I think you gave us the most important one, frankly. So, Keith, you also performed with improv theater groups in Chicago while you were studying them ethnographically. What did performing teach you that watching couldn't?
I was at the University of Chicago, I mentioned, and Chicago is well known in the United States as the center of this genre of theater where the actors start performing on stage without having a script, and they don't have any aspect of a script. They don't even have a rough outline. They don't go on stage with some notion that we're going to be a husband and a wife or that we're going to be getting married. They have nothing whatsoever. And that's their intention. They actually want to have everything emerge from the beginning. So they have even less structure than a jazz ensemble. So a jazz ensemble, they know they have a key, they have a harmonic structure. They're going to be playing let's say a blues that's a 12-bar structure. With an improvisational theater performance, they really have nothing. So I was fascinated by this kind of performance where the actors don't know anything. Then they start performing, and within a few lines of dialogue, something coherent exists. And there's an audience, and the audience, they have to see something coherent. If it's completely chaotic, they're not going to have an entertaining experience. Uh, and the actors have to construct this on the spot. So you asked about me playing piano. Yeah, so I could be in the audience just taking notes. In my case, I had a video camera on a tripod. So after the fact, I transcribed all of these performances, and I used some fairly rigorous conversation analysis methodologies and was able to get some scientific findings about how these interactional dynamics work. But in my case, I auditioned to become the pianist for a Chicago improvisational theater group. And as the pianist on the side of the stage, there were often genres of improvisational theater where I would perform, I would play piano during the improvised performance, and I would be improvising with them. So it was a similar experience to playing in a jazz ensemble where there was that interactional dynamic. So I had that subjective experience rather than only having distance of being an objective observer from the audience.
I was curious, Keith, that did you learn the piano from childhood?
Yes, I started when I was 10 and I was taking
Mm,
classical training. So I think,
mhm.
like, I don't know very many people who have jazz lessons when they're 10 years old.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
so my parents got a piano, and I think, a lot of, I guess, middle class Americans, if they can afford a piano for their children, and or piano lessons. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I went through grade one piano book and then grade two piano book. So I
Mm.
learned how to read notes and then gradually harder and harder. And I had an aptitude for it and I was willing to work hard enough. I really enjoyed it. So that was age 10. And by the time I was 15 and 16, I was playing, Bach and
Yeah.
Mozart
Mhm.
and
Mm,
Beethoven. And then I was in competitions
mm.
uh, where, there would be judges evaluating. Uh, and all of that was very much scored. It was on the page. There was no improvisation whatsoever. In my high school, I became known as a good musician, and I was playing scored music for our high school musicals, like Hollywood musicals, and all of that was also written out music. Like The Sound of Music, I would play while
Yeah. Wow.
while the singers would be singing up on stage. So I was recommended to the jazz ensemble,
Mm.
and I had no idea that there would be no written music for the jazz ensemble, but
Wow.
it
Mm.
sounded fun.
Mhm.
But the first rehearsal, I got the music, but the music didn't have any notes on it, and I had no idea. So the music only had chord symbols, and I was expected to improvise everything. Of course, I know that now, but I did not know. No one told me, and I was lost. I didn't know what to do. So that was my first experience with jazz. And really, it was at the age of 17 at this point. I thought I was a good
Wow.
pianist, but yeah, I had to learn all over again, like learning a completely new instrument.
Yes. So it sounds like the seeds of just improvising started really early for you. And perhaps just the situation demanded that ability to get recognized. Just from what you said, a couple of thoughts came to my mind. That do you agree with the 10,000 hours of practice theory?
Oh, yes, you're referring to this. It goes back to the 1990s. It's Anders Ericsson, studies of expertise and expert performance, finding that you invest 10,000 hours of practice before you reach the highest levels of expert performance. And then famously popularized in a book by Malcolm Gladwell in the early 2000s. Yeah, I mean, it's a research finding, empirical research finding, so I don't disagree with it. Yes, you must invest lots and lots of time
Lots of
in
practice and efforts.
mastering your craft. I don't think anyone can demonstrate a high level of creativity without investing that effort. Yeah, so I'd say one of the creativity myths, and I say this in my creativity textbook, it's called Explaining Creativity. Uh, there's a creativity myth that the experts are, I don't know, hidebound by convention and they're not going to be creative because they know too much. And they are the most creative people are going to come in from nowhere and have wild and crazy ideas because they're not bound by too much expertise. And that just really doesn't happen. The people who have the most creative ideas really are the people who have the most knowledge. Uh, so, yeah, you really do
Yeah.
need to know
Hmm.
your stuff to have the most creative ideas. So, sorry, you just have to pay your dues. There's no
Yeah.
shortcuts.
Hmm. So it sounds that you were and you are so serious about piano. How did you think of developing? First, you went into the field of game design. So how did you keep transitioning and land up that into the field of creativity, and then manage both the music and the creativity?
Oh, you mean to continue with music? So, I'd always say that music for me is a hobby. And no, I've never been, I'd say, a professional level of ability. So, I'm very humble about my performing ability. If any of the musicians I play with are watching this, I'll say, You are much better than I am. And I'm always grateful that any professional lets me play with them. But, uh,
Mm, mm,
but yes, I try my best. And but I probably spent at least 10,000 hours at this point. I'm in my 60s at this. So I play better now than I ever have at any
mhm,
point in my life. And it's something I think I could have been much better if I had dedicated my life to it. But my potential is much greater with being a researcher and a writer. So
mm, mm.
I think
No,
I made
that's
the right choice.
No, you made the perfect choice because actually we need practitioners who also bring the insider's perspective to creativity studies. Otherwise, if when it's purely academic, it remains like an outsider's perspective. And so I think that since you have this dual ability, there's so much more that is uncovered thanks to that. I had there's this one persistent cultural narrative that creativity requires suffering: the tortured artist, the depressive writer. You've argued that the scientific evidence for a link between mental illness and creativity is far weaker than the mythology suggests. So, where did this mad genius myth come from? And why do we hold on to it so tightly?
I'm surprised that it keeps coming back, or at least that it doesn't go away, with the large amount of evidence that creativity is associated with mental health and that engaging in creativity actually increases well being, and
Mm,
that people who are mentally healthy are more creative. So, when I said earlier that people in the flow state are more likely to be creative and that people who engage in creative pursuits are more likely to be in the flow state. So when I say all of those things, your listeners are going to nod and say, well, of course. So now think about that and say, how incompatible is that with the notion that being crazy and mentally ill is going to be associated with creativity? Those two things just don't fit together. And the scientific research that really, the evidence does not support the claim that mental illness is associated with creativity. There have been some widely cited studies going back to the 1900s, 1800s,
mm,
that seem to suggest that there were links, but those have been debunked and used very poor methodology. And in many cases, actually found exactly the opposite, that creativity was not associated with mental illness. Those studies are still cited incorrectly. I'm astonished at how poor this scholarship is. Yeah, so people are going to get mad at me and put this in the comments, but yeah, I just can't believe that people are still talking about this. The scholarship is so clear that
mm,
there is not a link between mental illness and creativity. I can be very certain of that. Research is very clear. Uh,
mm,
at the most you could say is that there might be some people someday kind of look like they might be a little more creative. I mean, you really have to stretch to, but no, there's no
mm.
link.
Your very first book was Pretend Play as Improvisation. What did studying children reveal to you?
That was almost an accident. I was getting my PhD at the University of Chicago in a PhD program called the Human Development. And I was interested in improvisation and group dynamics, as I still am, and studying jazz and improvisational theater. And I had almost accidentally done an observational study of a preschool classroom of 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And I transcribed their conversation while they were engaged in fantasy play with each other, like children do. They were playing with little plastic dinosaurs, or they were pretending to be a mother and a daughter. And this type of dialogue they were engaged in was very similar to adult improvisational theater. Uh, and I was performing with these improvisational theater groups, so I couldn't help but notice these parallels. And I looked at the developmental psychology literature, and no one had pointed this out, this parallel between children's play dialogues and improvisational theater dialogues. So that's what I chose to do my doctoral thesis on, was this parallel between improvisational theater dialogues and children's play dialogues. And then I rewrote my thesis as my first book. It's called Pretend Play as Improvisation.
Nice. Keith, what's the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious in creative work?
The unconscious would be the place where ideas are not directed, concepts are bouncing around like a stew or a soup. uh, there's a more opportunity for more ideas and concepts to be potentially connecting with each other. Uh, I'm not as much of an expert on this as some other psychologists are, but I'd say the conscious mind has less capacity to hold ideas and information than the unconscious mind. So you imagine a funnel where there are many, many ideas and concepts in the unconscious mind not being directed and not being guided. And creativity researchers will often talk about conceptual combination or remote or distant associations. And when these concepts and your subconscious mind uh, connect with each other in a certain way that has a kind of stability to it, that's when they tend to become noticed by your conscious mind. And that's when we have this sensation of insight. These concepts are bouncing against each other all the time in your subconscious mind, and most of them are just not interesting. So your conscious mind has no reason to notice them. So if there's a certain stability to the combination, that's when you'd have this sensation of insight, and it pops into your conscious mind. And then, yeah, so that's what we would call the moment of insight.
Yeah. Thanks for explaining that, because I think there's so much of confusion that when we talk about the unconscious, what area are we referring to? And I think that's the area of just what perhaps we feel, or something that we don't even recognize. It seemingly seems to emerge out of nowhere, and yet there's so much going on there, because we don't need the help of the conscious mind to even recognize what the unconscious is throwing, perhaps. And you rightly put it that that's the moment of insight. So I think that that's lovely. That's probably the point that connects both of these and helps creativity to emerge.
Right. And in my case, the narrative I just presented is very much a cognitivist story. A lot of people would have given you more of a, I don't know, more of a mystical,
Mm.
perhaps story of the unconscious. So I'm a
Mhm.
cognitive psychologist. So when I talk about the unconscious, I'm talking about conceptual combinations uh, coming to the attention of the conscious mind. But yeah, I'm a cognitive psychologist. So that's how I tend to think about the relationship. And some creativity researchers will talk about how the conscious mind might, to some extent, direct the unconscious mind. So there might be some sense in which your conscious mind could, I mean, there are things that you are focused on at various times in your life. So your unconscious mind is generally not going to be thinking about things completely unrelated to what your conscious mind will be. So, yeah, so there's always going to be uh, a relationship there.
Hmm. Hmm. Keith, I'd like to sort of now come to a question and an interest spot that people are consumed with at this point, which is AI and creativity. So I had a couple of questions for you. The first is that, you've been talking about AI long before ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, and the rest, all the AI that we have. Is this what you had envisioned when you were first thinking about it?
I was doing AI research in the late 1970s and the early
Whoa.
1980s, but that was my undergraduate degree was in computer science at MIT in 1981. And MIT was known at that time as a center of artificial intelligence research. But at that time, it was what was known as symbolic artificial intelligence. What is happening now, the type of machine learning, is very different mathematically and algorithmically. We were aware of this type of algorithm even in the late 1970s, but we didn't think very much of it. And honestly, we tended to look down on it and had very much preference for symbolic AI. But if you read the rhetoric and the narratives that people were describing in the newspapers at that time, artificial intelligence was very much in the media in the early 1980s. So when I read the newspapers in the past few years, it's quite similar. So I have to admit, to some extent, I'm a little bit jaded. I don't know if I'd say I'm a skeptic, but I'd say I'm not bullish about AI. I certainly
Mhm.
don't believe general intelligence is around the corner. I don't think we're going to have an artificial general intelligence. I think we're decades away if it will ever happen. In terms of creativity, I've written about this in my Substack newsletter. What we're getting from today's machine learning is nothing like what people do. I've talked about this in our conversation is the focus on the process and this type of iterative wandering process and a certain type of agency, as you mentioned, and creative practice, and then ideas emerging from
Mhm.
engaging in this type of practice. It's not at all what a Claude or a ChatGPT will do. There's no sense of improvisationality. There's no sense of engaging in a dialogue with materiality. So creative things are certainly generated by these algorithms, but they're not generated anything like humans generate what they do. So I suppose you could say, who cares? Maybe what they're doing is superior to the way humans do it. But as a psychologist, I'm interested in studying humans and how humans do it. So I'm just not that interested in
Right.
today's generative AI because they don't help me understand people. Um,
Right. But just seeing the way that people are gravitating towards this, what do you think are the main dangers or threats if this continues, and if people just start to lose their critical thinking ability because they're just now getting used to the world of ready made? What do you think is perhaps, the real threat that we should really be cautious about? Because I think those who have that degree of confidence, that degree of seeking, they would in fact use AI purely as a tool, as something that might aid them, but they would never be dependent on it. But that's happening nowadays. And um, just what are your thoughts, or is there any way we could be cautious, we could self-regulate when we actually use these tools?
I use Chat GPT all the time. I haven't experimented with the other ones, so I'm just settled on Chat GPT. Um, it's made me much more productive. I don't think I've been less creative. I have offloaded some of what I would have created before. So So, yeah, for example, in my own podcast, I might ask ChatGPT to write my YouTube description, first draft, so I can have a YouTube video every week instead of every other week because I can be a little bit more efficient. But I'll rewrite everything and I'll delete half of it. Yeah, so I don't know if I'd say I'm less creative. I certainly would say I'm more productive. I'd say engaging in a different type of creative process. So I consider it to be a tool, like any other tool, but that's the way I use it. I know that it could be used in a very lazy manner,
Mhm.
where
Yeah, yeah.
someone would not use it the way I use it. They would just have it
Yeah, kids are
generate and
using it to do
pass
their
it on.
homework. Yeah, no, the scary thing is that kids are using it to do their homework. They now don't think it's necessary to study anymore. And these are real practical issues that are coming with this. But we'll see.
Right. In my case, I'm all college professors. We are struggling with this. And this past 2 semesters, I no longer assign writing outside of class. I have my students come in and they use a pencil and paper, and
Perfect.
I say the first 15 minutes of class, you write the thing I used to have you write
Mm,
outside of class and then email me. You don't do
mhm,
that anymore. You write
mhm.
it when you come to class. And then I take photos of it and I have ChatGPT transcribe it for me. Uh, it's and then turn it into text. It's very good at doing that. So no, I do not. I can't do that anymore. And I mentioned it 30 or so minutes ago. I have my students create a typeface, and then I have them create a DJ music track. So
Mhm.
there's no way they can use
Mm,
ChatGPT or Claude for that.
right.
I've checked. So no, they can't do
Yeah.
that yet. Maybe someday. And the students, I've learned, they are very unhappy when they get an assignment where they can't use AI.
Yes, I'm sure. Now, Keith, I'd like to come to one of the main things you talk about, which is group creativity. Your book, Group Genius, argues that most of what we've heard about famous inventions is wrong, that television, the airplane, even Monopoly emerged from collaborative webs, not lone geniuses. So, could you sort of describe these examples too, so that we get to the real idea of what group creativity could look like?
We hear so many stories of famous inventions and the one genius who came up with the idea. And much earlier in our interview, I talked about the myth of the idea and
Hmm.
the linear insight myth, that you have the idea and then you execute. And what goes along with the linear insight myth is the lone genius myth. So if you can have an idea that represents your creation, then of course one person can have the idea. But then I contrasted that with the truth of creativity, which is that it is a long process with iterations and improvisationality that involves having many different ideas along the way. And once you have a process with many different ideas, then of course, all those ideas don't have to be had by one single person. And historically, they aren't. They're had by many different people. So, what I found is when you take these historical stories like Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb, for example, and you or Albert Einstein coming up with E equals MC squared, you scratch beneath the surface. You don't even have to scratch very deeply, and you find quickly that those stories are false and that the real story is one of collaborative creativity over time. Samuel Morse did not invent the telegraph. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb. Alexander Graham Bell did not invent the telephone. Uh, yeah, Isaac Newton did not discover gravity. Yeah, so you can throw one out.
Right.
I've given so many keynote lectures, and people will raise their hand and say, "What about, X, Y, or Z?" And I've been doing this for 20 years. So by now, I think I've heard just about every person has called out just about every inventor. And if it was someone I haven't heard of, I might go look them up afterwards. And yeah,
Hmm.
pretty much always it turns out it's a story of collaboration. And so I call it group genius. My book called Group Genius, I first published in 2007, and second edition in 2017. So in 2007, I told the story of the Monopoly board game. A lot of times, these lone genius myths were created intentionally for PR purposes,
Mm.
or in some cases for intellectual property purposes. So, a person who wants to get the patent will tell a false story, a claim of invention, so that they can claim rights to the invention, right? So there are many incentives to claim. It's a better story for the newspaper reporters. You can get the intellectual property rights, but also it aligns with our tendency to believe in this lone genius myth.
So, Keith, your recently released book on learning to see. Could you tell us more about the ideas behind it? I mean, I think the best place to begin is um, this idea of learning to see.
It's almost mystical, right? Learning to see. In this new book, I've spent the past 15 years interviewing professional artists and designers about how they create. And I chose to interview artists and designers who were professors in professional schools of art and design. So they're teaching graduate students and undergraduate students who are getting the degrees, BFA and MFA degrees. So they're very articulate about how they create. And I discovered that they create exactly in this improvisational and iterative fashion. So I already, from my previous creativity research, I was very familiar with this type of process, but I had not studied artists and designers. And they were incredibly articulate. So I learned a much richer and deeper understanding of how working professionals engage in this type of process, but also how you can teach other people to do it this way. And what I discovered was what is almost a kind of personal transformation that these students go through to learn how to master this type of process. It's almost like changing yourself to
Mm.
uh, learn how to discover yourself. So when they say learning to see, you're not just learning to see the paint on the canvas, but you're learning to see inside yourself to understand what it is that you're actually doing and what it
Mm.
is that you're representing in the work that you're generating.
I think that that's so helpful because um, I think that to see, look within, look outside, and make those connections are what people who really want to learn about creativity struggle with the most. So, a book which offers such a wholesome perspective because you didn't look at it from one dimension. So, how was this journey of involving so many people in this? And how did you distill them? Did you have certain ideas when you picked the people that were part of your interviews?
Oh, so many people that I interviewed because it went on for 15 years. I was so fascinated that I just kept
Wow.
going
Mm.
with over 100 artists and designers, and then 20 different disciplines. So there were painters, sculptors, graphic designers, architects, advertising, industrial designers. And what I found was this underlying shared essence of creativity. This is something you might not necessarily assume that painters would have the same creative process as someone who works in advertising, right?
Mhm.
So that's very powerful. Not only that they use a similar set of creative practices, but that they would teach students in a very similar way. Uh, and another thing I discovered is that what they're doing is they're teaching their students to in a sense, shift the creative process out of their own mind into a practice of engaging with the world, with the materials that they're using. And in the case of design, with users that they're designing for. But even with the artist and the designers, it would be with the viewers, the people who are going to be viewing their work. So it's not only something that you're doing for yourself, but it's about communication,
Mm.
about connecting with others. So yeah, some very powerful messages that I had not gotten from
Mm.
studying jazz musicians and improvisational theater actors, but still that improvisational iterative process. But in this sense of learning to see yourself and learning to see the process that you're going through was the powerful message of the new book.
Yeah, I think it sounds like this would be really helpful to those who are wishing to connect the dots and feel that they're missing some important dots. I think that it sounds that this book could really help in navigating that. So, anyway, Keith, I know you've got to go. So, I think that our conversations could just keep going on because you have so much to talk about, so much to share. But thank you so much for taking the time and being with us on the Creativity Dialogues today. I think your insights are going to shed so much of light on this topic. So, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Keith.